it's the amount, but it's also the extent which assimilation happens. Because we talk about like, right. Well, melting right. Is like, is Canada really a melting pot? And we look at the history of like, well, even in, I don't have, maybe I won't get the number right. In the US, it's slightly different than Canada, but Canada was even like 85 to 90% white, even into like the 80s and 90s.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was still right. Predominantly right. like the percentage. And it's funny with given that as a starting point, and then listening to all these conversations about like white supremacy of like, well, white people doing better than other minorities in Canada. Like, well, of course there's going to be a majority representation in a majority country if it, if it started with a certain demographic.
Yeah. If you have an established, family that's been here for, 100 years or whatever, of course that's going to be.
Well, and that's part of it, but I guess within that was European and that was Christian, but you also had like, well, you had the Catholics and you had the Protestants, and you didn't always get along. You also didn't always get along between, depending on what European country this was immigrating. Like, well, the Irish had a really rough time in North America, and some were indentured servants, and like, even just because they were just from Europe didn't mean there wasn't conflict.
That's exactly right. Well, and to that point, I'll make 2 points. I just recently read a book called The Weirdest People in the World, and weird was all capital. It was an acronym for, here it is, Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. That's what weird stands for. Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. And he talks about how specifically with the Irish immigration into the U.S. in the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, they initially were like very poorly treated. They were not well integrated, and they didn't have a good time. They were considered in some areas, like they were classified under the same classification that they classified black people as separate from whites. Like they were classified away from whites. And it took like significant outreach programs by the Catholic Church in the Eastern United States to, like, in as many words, like civilize the Irish immigrants into the U.S. into like a higher standard of living way of life. Because, this isn't a justification of any, poor treatment of people, but like it was just objective that the Irish immigrants at that time were living a much more like kind of, culturally primitive, comparatively way of life to the naturalized Americans at that time. And so, it wasn't considered racist to, integrate these people into a different way of living. It was necessary to avoid the type of blowback that they were receiving as a group of people, sometimes very unjustifiably. So, which my second point is, you look at the difference between, like, if you maybe wanted to say the next most represented group of immigrants in Canada, I think most people would agree, at least in this part of the country where we are in Alberta, is Filipinos. Lots of Filipinos have emigrated to Canada in the last 20, 30 years. But we don't hear the same discourse surrounding Filipino Canadians as we do with Indian Canadians, because in my opinion, and probably the opinion of others, the Philippines are a Catholic country. So they're instantly more in line with the traditional Western values that have built this part of the world, and they integrate a little bit easier. They are more apt to just kind of be natural into living this lifestyle that we do in the West than Indians are. Indians are very proud people. They have a very distinct culture that grew completely independently from the West for thousands of years. So of course there's going to be a difference in how they know how to live their lives in their everyday lives versus the average Canadians. And of course, because of that, there's going to be conflict, for better or worse. It's not saying, like, no one is saying that, you can't maintain your certain, the cultural features of your homeland that make you feel comfortable and loved in your communities. But by the same token, no no Canadian that I know anyway would dream of moving to India and forcing Indians to live in a Western Canadian way of life. Like it never seems to work the other way, you know?
Yeah, it's assuming a lot that like, well, this place that is not my home has to conform to me as an outsider.
Yeah.
You wouldn't see it in Japan. Like you wouldn't go to
Certainly
Japan
not.
and like you wouldn't claim discrimination if like, well, they didn't hire me. It's like, well, how's your Japanese? Like, well,
Yeah.
I know like 40 phrases and my Japanese is kind of broken. Like, well, you would
What did you
obviously,
expect?
yeah, you'd see some advantages to, well, better resonating with either the culture of where you're moving to, the language, or some of these other values. So yeah, the Filipino, with them being Catholic, that is obviously it makes that so much easier. And I feel like
Such a smoother transition. Yeah.
when people adopt the values of a place and has established values, I feel like people are a lot more welcoming. And you can see this. Japan's a perfect example of the people who live there and they learn the language and the customs and they resonate with the culture. Like people are quite friendly to them. Like
they love that. They're
they're
people
happy
here
that
like. Go ahead.
yeah, they're happy that you put in the effort to adopt these cultures and their principles.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I was gonna say it's only like, North Americans that say it's like cultural appropriation to wear a kimono or whatever if you're like into Japanese culture. They love that shit. They love the, oh, you want to partake in our culture. Like that's like what an honor to, they feel a sense, because they have such a firm cultural identity that they're proud of, that they feel honored when other people take the time to learn about it and partake in it, which is, I feel like, how it should be. Like Daryl Cooper, who we're both fans of, Martyr Made podcast, was recently on Joe Rogan, and he was talking about actually Ireland as well. I think you probably watched it, where he said, Ireland's on track to be like white people are like Irish people are expected to be a minority by 2070. Yeah, in Ireland.
And the funny thing is, those kind of statements, they're celebrated.
Yeah.
But apply that to any other country. If you said in Japan, like they are destined to be a minority in their own country, they'd be like, well, that's not good. Like what's going to happen?
They would never allow it.
What's going to happen to the Japanese culture in that case?
Yeah. And that's what he said. He's like, he's like, I believe that true diversity would mean, China is for Chinese people, and India is for Indian people, and Ireland is for Irish people. Like that, like when you're traveling the world, you don't want to have it be that anywhere you go is just this like identical cultural mishmash of like like nondescript, global citizenry. Like, no, you want to go to Ireland because you want to go to an Irish pub and interact with Irish people. Like you want that to be the case. You want to go to, if you want to visit India, or you want to visit Tanzania, or you want to visit, Japan, like you want those cultures to be like, true diversity is when you can experience all those cultures in their true forms and not have them be a melting pot, quote unquote, of some post-national identity. Like that isn't what diversity is. And further, why is it that only the very small part of the globe that is traditionally known as white nations, white Western nations, why are they the only ones that need to become multicultural? Who's fighting to make Saudi Arabia multicultural, or to make Bangalore multicultural, Bangladesh multicultural? You know what I mean?
It's because if a predominantly white country doesn't stay predominantly white, they're going to turn into a Nazi state. That's the fear. It comes down to
the post-war consensus, right?
Like you got to have diversity, because strong unified national identities are ultimately dangerous under that idea. So
and there's more examples of general ignorance by the average Canadian or American or Westerner in general, because the West does not have a monopoly on fascist or communist governments, for certainly.
Yeah. And then you run into cases of like you apply any of these principles to somewhere else, and suddenly it becomes hateful. There's a certain corner of the internet that is jokingly like they have these like fake advertising complaints of like, well, we need more immigration and more diversity in Israel. And they're not happy about it. Like, well, and they treat that as, well, no, that's genocidal because you're trying to erase our people by doing that.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, if that's the admission, why isn't that true for Ireland? Why isn't that true for any other? Did the Scots
not deserve a country? Did the Angles not deserve a country? Did the Poles not deserve a country?
Yeah, and even in Canada, I guess we're trying to like define what a Canadian is, and we look at you can look at a first generation. You look at somebody who's born in Canada. It doesn't matter their skin color. You can tell the Canadianness through just their vibes
instantly,
and even that difference between somebody who's born in Canada, went through the Canadian school system, and then grew up with all the cultural aspects versus somebody who speaks English really well and adopts it later on, we can tell the difference.
Totally can.
It's, and not to say that the latter is bad. Like if that's somebody who's adopted our like Canadian values, great. But it is funny. You can tell the difference, and or people are warmer to somebody who grew up from birth just because these things resonate a little bit more.
Yeah, well, and there's a certain like I can see a certain evolutionary utility behind that because it makes sense. Like we in the West we have the I think unique advantage of living in a high trust society because that's just sort of a side effect of Western cultures that find their roots in Christianity. Like that's just something sort of unique to the Christian world, the Christian Western world that the rest of the world didn't get, because that's whatever your opinion on Christianity is, that's just sort of an effect of it. It leads to open societies.
Open arms in a way. They're like, well, Christ loves everybody. Like, well, there is a baked in anti-racist component to Christianity that not all other religions have that in them.
Well, that's exactly right. And also in that book I just mentioned, the weirdest people in the world, he talks too about how excuse me, in the I believe it was in the like late thousands or 1100s, something around there, to the 1200s. Are you familiar? Have you heard of the MFP, like the Catholic Church's MFP? Have you heard that acronym before?
I'm not sure.
It stands for the Marriage and Family Program. That's what the Catholic Church in the early 11th, 12th century, they restricted. Essentially, what they did was they restricted cousin marriage. It was very common in most. I mean, it is still very common today in a lot of Middle Eastern and the subcontinent. Cousin marriage is very common. Societies are very low trust societies have high rates of cousin marriage because they're naturally distrustful of people outside of their community clan. And so for various reasons, there's a whole book about it, but for various reasons, the Catholic Church instituted the Marriage and Family Program, which restricted cousin marriage to, I believe it was the sixth step. Like you couldn't marry you had to go 6 steps away from your family. And what that had the effect of doing was, if you lived in a small town in like the Roman Empire, like there's a very high chance that like no one in your community was further away from you than 2 or 3 steps. So if you couldn't legally get married to any of those people, you had to expand your circle. You had to move about the country. You had to go to different lands and meet new people. Like that is a direct we can see how that would create a much more open society, because people were forced to meld and integrate and become more worldly people and expand their circles. And so, there's obviously, more knock-on effects from that. But in creating an open society like that, and having those values come, passed down to us here, 1,000 years later, we're in a very unique spot now compared to the rest of the world, that I think people both take for granted and opens them up to being taken advantage of, because of the natural inclination that we have here to be welcoming, perhaps at our own detriment of various other cultures that don't share those values.
Yeah, I think that's a feature of Christianity as well as liberalism, that it can be, there can be too much of a good thing in those kind of cases.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also, you get into cases where like even the idea of diversity gets like, well, what does that actually mean? You go to Europe and they're like, well, that European is not just like you go to England and like genetically there is a lot of variety between the Nordic and Slavic, and you go to Turkey and you have a whole other mix of people there, and you go back to Spain and it is not a ethnically homogenized place.
No.
But in how we view the West and how we view our DEI framework, white is an ever expanding category. And it's actually reducing diversity. Like white's just not brown, but even like, I guess, and then you're like, well, what happens when you're a quarter black? And what happens when you're like, you run into these logical questions where it's useful. Like if you can claim it, then it's useful. Then you can just play the game. And so I'm glad we circled back and like talked about kind of the like foundations of Canada, because that gets woven into, well, what's our national identity? And I am aware that there are some more nationalistic types that are now saying like, well, I'm seventh generation Canadians, and I have a, like my great grandfather sailed down the St. Lawrence and did this and that. And for them, they feel like that gives them more of a claim to what Canada, like the Canadian identity is, because of that.
Yeah.
And I feel like we're into a losing battle at that point, because it's a no true Scotsman situation,
sure.
Literally, yeah. Like at that point. And some of them are Scottish and some of them are not true Scottish. So
those are the newfies, right?
But what I wanted to touch on is that the rise in kind of anger orientated unity, it's the lowest resolution way to unify people. And that exists when people are marginalized. And I don't love using that word, but I mean, like when people are gaslit into not being allowed an identity,
yeah,
or not being allowed to be either, like, if you're not if you can't be proud to be European, or you can't be proud to be, like if there's a certain range of origins that people can't be proud of, then that's going to push people into like, well, they feel that hate, and then that pushes them into a corner, and then that's the unifying principle around them. And I feel like all of this anti-European sentiment, anti-Christian, that's going to create the enemy that they're so fearful in the first place. Yes. And it doesn't exist when these rules are applied equally to everybody.
Yes, that's for sure. And it's maybe that's a good place to kind of wrap her up for right now, because this could be a whole nother hour. But
you could dive into that for a whole hour to unpack that.
Yeah, but to kind of wrap her up, I think that's it's sort of a maybe part of the human condition to like the thing that you fear the most. Maybe you just end up behaving in a way that brings that into your life. You know what I mean? Like if you're so fearful of an ideology coming for you, and that's all you can think about, and that's all you can see, it soon consumes your life to the point where it may as well be true to you, even if it isn't objectively true. You know what I mean? So there's this is getting very esoteric and maybe very, very high level right now, but I guess at the end of the day we have to. I think we have to not be afraid. Like the Canadian way is to be very, we're very meek. We like to think we're very kind and we're very welcoming and we're very accepting, but you can't. I think Gad Saad would call that suicidal empathy, and you can't be so. In the same way that the saying goes, like you can't be so open-minded that your brains fall out. The same way you can't be so welcoming and accepting of diversity that you allow that diversity to kill the spirit that allowed it to be accepted in the first place.